They thought you were the game, easy to read, easy to figure out. They watched your moves like you were a puzzle they could solve, a pattern to break, a weakness waiting to be found. Every glance, every silence, every pause, they dissected it like it meant something obvious. But what they never understood was that while they were watching you, you were watching everything. The board, the players, the tempo, the strategy behind the noise. You weren't trying to win one move, you were memorizing the cycle. You weren't reacting, you were recording, observing who plays loud, who folds under pressure, who smiles while lying, and who's already broken before the first move even lands. They thought they were in control because they had your name in their mouth, but you had their patterns in your mind. They played for attention, you played for position, and the moment they made the mistake of thinking they knew you, you already knew how they'd fall, because when you're the quiet one in the room, people assume you're behind. They forget silence isn't surrender, it's surveillance. They analyzed your footsteps, thinking you were chasing something. They didn't realize you were tracing theirs, mapping every misstep they tried to hide. They thought they had time. They thought they had the edge. But the clock wasn't ticking for you. It was ticking for them. You watched how they moved when they thought no one was watching. That's when truth shows itself, not in action but in instinct. When pressure hits, when silence falls, when the lights are off and the mask slips. That's where the data lives. That's what you waited for. They wanted you predictable, simple, easy to read. But nothing about your silence was empty. Every second you spent not speaking, you were downloading, calculating, studying not just the players, but the rules they pretend don't exist. They were trying to decode your strategy while you were already 5 layers above the game they were playing, because this was never about the move you made. It was about how long you could go without making one and still be in control. They confused your silence with hesitation, your distance with fear. But what they called detachment was actually vision, wide enough to see the whole map, deep enough to read moves before they were made. They thought you were stalling, but you weren't stalling, you were staging. They wanted fast plays. You built quiet traps. They moved in public. You set your pieces in the shadows. Every time they celebrated too early, you noted what they revealed. Every weakness disguised as confidence, every careless word dressed up as strategy, filed away, stored, indexed. By the time they thought they figured you out, they had already given away everything you needed. They don't know what to do with someone who doesn't react, who doesn't rush, who lets them think they're winning while actually sinking. That's the art of control, to let people feel safe inside their mistake, long enough for it to seal itself shut. You never needed a plan they could see. You needed a board they never realized they were standing on. And now, they're out of moves. They kept asking the wrong questions. Why aren't you reacting? Why don't you fight back? They didn't realize. Silence isn't passivity. It's precision. You weren't playing to prove anything. You were letting them reveal who they were without lifting a single finger. Every loud move they made told you more than their silence ever could. The way they talked over others, the way they smiled after cutting corners, the way they bragged without realizing they were broadcasting their own blind spots. You never had to interrupt, you just had to listen. And while they thought you were frozen, you were tracking. While they laughed, you logged. While they schemed, you structured. They underestimated how dangerous a quiet observer becomes, especially one with memory sharp enough to turn observation into leverage. Because studying people isn't about reading their words, it's about learning their instincts. You watched how they fold, who they follow, what they fear. You understood the currency of pressure, and you saved it. You didn't need to be the loudest to be the one holding the map. You just needed to be the only one not panicking. And now, you're not playing the game, you're controlling its rhythm. They tried to corner you by reading your patterns, but the problem was you didn't have any. You moved in ways that weren't for them to interpret. You shifted based on data, not drama. While they were reacting to emotion, you were decoding outcomes. That's why they couldn't trap you. You weren't playing to win the moment. You were mapping the collapse. They made moves to be impressive. You made moves that made them irrelevant. And the silence, it wasn't just quiet, it was control. Because when people don't know what you're thinking, they start projecting. They fill in the gaps with their own fears, their own insecurities, and slowly they begin unraveling themselves, thinking they're unraveling you. You studied posture, timing, micro-reactions. You learned the difference between noise and signals, and when the signals repeated, you knew exactly when to strike. Not for attention, not for applause, for impact, for shift, for silence that ends the room. And that's the danger in watching the whole board. You don't need to fight every piece. You just remove the one that holds everything together. If you're still watching, they already lost. Subscribe and stay unreadable. Eventually, they stopped trying to predict you and started fearing you, not because you were loud, but because you were too quiet for too long. Silence creates anxiety. The unknown creates paranoia, and your ability to remain unreadable turned you into something they couldn't categorize. They started double-checking everything, what they said around you, how they moved, what they revealed. That's when you knew the dynamic had flipped. You weren't being studied anymore. You were being avoided. Not because they saw your strength, but because they couldn't trace where it came from. And while they grew louder, trying to reclaim the space they once felt safe in, you didn't say a word. You didn't announce the shift. You didn't need to. Their fear did the talking for you. Their instability became your evidence. Every overreaction, every nervous glance, every fake smile, they all proved what you already knew. You were no longer part of the game. You were the variable no one planned for. And when people can't measure you, they assume you're everywhere. They started whispering your name like a warning. Not because you changed, but because you stopped playing by rules they understood. You didn't need to raise your voice, they raised it for you. They repeated your silence so often, it echoed louder than any threat. They looked for allies, you moved alone. They chased validation, you chased clarity. And every time they thought they caught up to you, they realized they were still playing the same outdated game, one you left behind months ago. Because you never fought to be seen. You moved like someone who already knew how the story ends. They had strategy, you had structure. They pivoted with panic, you adjusted with patience. And in a world where everyone performs, you just stayed still long enough for their masks to slip. You weren't mysterious, you were meticulous, and now that the dust has cleared, you're not just a player they can't read, you're the pattern that rewrote theirs. At some point, they stopped trying to beat you, not because you were stronger, but because you became unpredictable. They realized you weren't reacting out of emotion. You were responding out of understanding. You didn't mirror chaos, you filtered it. And by the time they noticed, it was too late. They were dancing for cameras. You were studying the shadows. They tried to change the narrative, twist the story, paint you as distant, arrogant, passive. But truth doesn't need defense. You weren't hiding, you were observing. And the ones who observe the longest always strike with the most precision. They forgot the oldest rule of power. It's not about the move you make, it's about how inevitable it feels when you make it. And now, everything you do feels calculated. Every step rehearsed. Every silence loaded. Because they thought reading you was the goal, but you were never meant to be understood. You were meant to shift the tempo, change the terms, and leave them wondering if they were ever in control at all. And now they don't move unless you do. Now they're playing cautious, watching your silence like it's a ticking clock. They don't know when you'll move or how, and that's the point. You've trained them without speaking, conditioned them through inaction. While they burned out trying to provoke you, you sat still. And they unraveled. They talk about strategy like it's something loud, flashy, but real strategy never announces itself. It arrives cold, controlled, hidden under discipline, and that's what you mastered, not moves, but timing. You didn't win by being the best at the start. You won by being the only one left at the end, still sharp, still steady, still in control. You watched them exhaust themselves trying to decode a blueprint that didn't exist. They thought you had a secret, but the truth is, you had patience. You made quiet your armor, restraint your weapon. While they overshared, overstepped, overplayed, you remained still, present, absorbing every failure they called a flex. And now, you're not just unreadable, you're untouchable. Not because you avoided risk, but because you understood which risks weren't worth the reaction. You didn't have to outplay them. You just had to outlast their noise. Now there's nothing left for them to analyze. No reaction, no weakness, no new move to dissect. They've circled you 1,000 times, hoping you'd slip, hoping silence was a glitch, not a tactic. but now they see it clearly. The stillness was the signal. The absence was the answer. You didn't just watch the board, you rewrote it, quietly, line by line. While they obsessed over your next step, you were redefining the rules beneath their feet. What they called hesitation was calibration. What they called mystery was structure. And now they're stuck, still moving pieces that don't matter anymore, still playing a game that's already ended for them. But you're not even on the board anymore. You're outside of it, above it, the one player who didn't need to play loud to win. Because when you understand the game fully, you don't just beat it, you erase it.